today's Enrollment Management Committee meeting. So let's just go down the row and see who's here. I'm Edward Martinez. I'm the co-chair of this committee.
Bob Miller, co-chair.
Are you the, John, are you the new AS representative in addition to Chris?
I believe I'm only sitting on it today.
Oh.
However, I'm not entirely sure. I may end up being.
Okay, thank you. And so let's go to Glenna.
Glenna Watterson, Classified Senate.
Shelley Gaskin, Business and CTE.
Eduardo Cairo, Social Sciences.
Okay. And Chris Fennessy. All right. Okay, so obviously there are a few people missing, so hopefully they'll show up in a short while. You have sorry, it's not in the agenda, but you have a copy of the minutes of the last meeting. Are there any additions, corrections, or comments about the minutes?
I have a comment regarding the number 3 summer 2012 schedule. Is that set then that there is going to be 150 classes, or is that something that's still going to be worked out?
At the moment, we're looking at a target of 150. Dr. Bell, who unfortunately is in another meeting right now and could not be here, but Dr. Bell and the deans are working towards that target of 150 for the summer.
Have the classes been determined? Is it still English, math, and ESL, or is it going to be more of a variety?
It's my understanding that courses are being selected based upon the completion agenda. So the deans are working with their faculty to determine which courses would be best for the completion agenda. I see Amy is shaking her head in agreement, so yes. And so is Ted.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other comments, questions, corrections to the minutes? Okay. Thank you. So the second item is the Enrollment Priorities Policy, number 4020. You have a copy in front of you. And just as a reminder, the first page is the policy page. And the items that you see in red are additions. Nothing is being removed at this point on the policy, so we simply have the wording of additions. But beginning on the second page, we have the procedures, and those items with the strike out we are discussing as removing from the procedures, and the items in red are additions or revisions. Now, I had hoped that Dina Chase would be here today because I think based on our discussion last time, I think that we could just go ahead and remove all of the wording from what was formerly Section 1. If I understood her correctly, that section is largely moot. It's a formula that we don't make use of anymore. So I think that we could just go directly into the revised wording for Section 2, where we are revising the priority for registration for the students. Is that basically, is there a consensus that we should move forward?
I seem to recall her actually saying that she wasn't really comfortable with the entire removal of something, perhaps something smaller that said, because without that means that there's nothing that specifically says those with higher units have higher priority than those with less units. It just says continuing students are a pool, but doesn't say within that pool who is priority.
But is that not addressed in under item 1J? Within each category listed above, times are assigned in the order of admission?
Oh, I suppose it would. I guess I didn't see that, but
exactly.
At the same time, it's not order of admission, is it? It's units that you've taken.
Well, that's item 2D, I believe. Well, that's part of that item 2D anyway. Yeah.
Okay. But you're saying that we need some clarification, that there should be...
I think so.
Okay. Anna? Okay. Yes. Okay, all right.
So I think it's smart to take out all of the things about 4 times, zero cap. That seems a bit superfluous, but I think that just having something that says, maybe even something about how the registration priority is based off of their cumulative units enrolled, or I'm sorry, completed.
I could see J being just put into the top description. I think that would save some, possibly clarified to allow for the changes.
So you're saying, Crystal?
That's
Well,
2D.
that's 2D, I
2D.
think. There's still that cap. That was still there.
But I also think what I hear Crystal and I'm sorry, your name again, I'm sorry?
John.
John and Chris saying is that maybe 1J, 2D can somehow be put up in one, because they speak to everything.
Okay. All right. Okay, so I'll go back and revise 1 still further. Okay.
So-
But it should be, greatest priority should, for registration.
Cumulative units, not order of admissions, what we were saying. Within these categories.
Right, based on cumulative units
Yeah.
completed here at
That's the
PCC.
terminology, it's up above.
Okay.
So would the group feel okay with perhaps Ed and myself and Dina and maybe Amy getting together and working through this language and coming up with the language? Would the group feel comfortable with that? Okay. Would Chris or John like to join us if your time allows? Okay, because we do want to move this along if we possibly can, so.
Right,
All right, so we'll do Dina,
okay.
Ed, Chris, and Bob,
Okay,
and we'll redo 1.
all right, very good. Okay, so let's go down to what was, Anna, please, go ahead.
I would say no, just because there's other, especially with the proposed idea I had about the appeals process. Since I think that has its own kind of thing. I think if we have that in too many places, it'll become too bureaucratic, and it's gonna be too many hoops to jump through to actually get them through that appeals process, or to deal with each student, especially with this new possible thing that we have here.
All right, so let's go now to, I guess, the old Section 2, potentially the new Section 1. So we have priority registration based on the following categories: residency, date of admission, program participation, and we have items A through J. Is there any further discussion of those items or their order?
I just want to ask, is this in terms of the order, is this the order that they're going to be taken in?
Yes, this is the proposed new order.
I'm saying, so the first person that gets registration is based on residency status, and then this number 2 would be date of admission to the college, and 3, program participation, then 4 would be A, continuing U. I'm trying to clarify how this is going to work.
Okay. No, A is a very large category, so it would include all continuing, new, and entering DSPS, EOPS, foster youth, military, and veteran students. Some
all
of
right,
those
yeah.
are specified in Title V, DSPS, EOPS, foster youth also. They have to be at the beginning of the list. And so we are saying anyone who's in those categories, DSPS and so on, they get to register first.
Right, but the way I read it is before them comes residency status. Each student is assigned a prior registration based upon the following: residency status. So I think that, so the way I read it, that's number one, that comes before continuing you reentering DSP. Am I reading that wrong?
Well, I would say that items A through J combine all of those different categories: residency status, date of admission, and program participation. So this is saying that within those three areas, this is the order in which those three areas will be further broken down.
And A comes before B and C and B,
Yes.
okay, got it.
And I would like to, the one that's continually bothered me is the continuing international students with F1 visas coming that high up on the list. And I wanted to ask a question. It seems like we could move that group further down, maybe tie them with G. And this is the theory, and see if this makes any sense, that these are tuition-paying students, and as a result, in most cases, a number of those students together actually pay for a section, which means that we could add sections that would be paid for by those international students, and that by adding those sections on top of what we would normally do by using FTES, we would actually provide additional seats for local students, which would not have been available had we not had the international revenue to mount the section. So therefore, we could logically move it down a few steps on the priority list, still be able to provide the international students their classes without putting them that high up on the list. Does that make any sense to anybody?
I agree with that very strongly.
So do I.
So then the question becomes, how far down, where would you put them? But I think everybody wins that way, and we don't put them, we don't make it this public statement that they go ahead of our local students.
Glenna?
Once you have all continuing students in, and if international students fall under that, there won't be any classes, and so you will be adding classes based on the fact that we've got their funding, because classes fill up so quickly once the continuing.
The answer is yes, that we logically, based upon the money that they provide us, we will be able to afford additional sections, which therefore would benefit local students as well, because we'd be able to mount those sections that we couldn't possibly mount prior to that.
Rod?
Yeah, thank you. Just one note about adding sections comprised entirely of international students. I think that from a teaching point of view, that poses some problems.
Right.
And so I think that you need to think about how you're going to do this, because it's important to have a good mix of international and native students in a class, just for the chemistry of it.
Right. And I think that's actually what I was referring to, is that in most cases, the deans, particularly Dean Ulmer, for example, do not want more than 40 or 50% of international students in any given section. So in most cases, that's pretty much how it goes, with the exception maybe of the ESL classes, I think. So that would be the premise, that they still pay enough to mount a class, mount a section. Maybe 50% of that section of, say, 30 student class would be international, 15. They would fund that section and make room for 15 native or local students to also come in, so everybody wins, so to speak. That's the theory.
I think Ted and then Anna?
Yeah, that's just, I wanted to clarify that the way we've looked at, other than ESL, where we don't mind having a class that's all international students because they need it, although not all of our ESL classes are international. But part of the thinking that we have is, if we add an additional section, roughly half of the students, if they're international, then that covers the cost of that section. So we can use them as a resource for increasing our section offering without impacting the general fund. But it would be to have a mix like that in other classes.
Anna and then Amy.
Well, I wasn't aware of a cap of 1,000, but putting that aside, there's a plan in development to be presented to the Board of Trustees, I think at the May study session, where we actually talk about, from a revenue enhancement strategy perspective, of increasing international student enrollment up to perhaps as many as 3,000 students over the next 3 or 4 years. So that's a plan that's in development, and whether it's approved or not, we will remain to be seen. But I also know that we have thus far added sections for international students, which gets us up to about 1149 right now, Ted, I think, or something like that, our current international enrollment. About that, I think. It's about 1,100, give or take, this spring.
Amy?
Yeah, I agree with moving the international students down to with the new international.
Right.
Not wait.
Agree.
But again, for clarity though, when we do add new sections for international students, is it just a practice that we keep them to the 60-40% mixture, or how do we manage that?
It's a work in progress. We just started trying to do this last fall. We did it for ESL only, so that wasn't an issue. And then for the spring, we did it very late in the game. So it's a pretty steep learning curve. But there were some, in biology we had mixed groups. In other areas we didn't have mixed groups. The issues that Rod mentioned definitely came up when we had non-ESL classes that were all F1 students. So we're trying to look at that kind of a mix.
Okay. But it's a work in progress. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. I think that one of the reasons that we had international students ranked rather high on the list is primarily because of concerns about following or making sure that they're complying with federal law, because international students do have to register in 12 units or more. Otherwise, they have significant problems with their F1 visas. So is there any concern from the perspective of the International Student Office and compliance with federal regulations?
I was actually about to bring that up. Is just the fact that is it feasible that in this theoretical idea that the classes will probably fill up mostly with the continuing students, and then we'll allow the F1 visa students to start enrolling. Will we have classes for them? I understand that we'll be adding classes because of their enrollment, but without their enrollment, will we have the funds to add those classes that they then need to enroll and thus to stay in the country?
So then are we suggesting that it would move, instead of down to F, move them into D, continuing in-district and international?
Because I think one of the concerns is not just to shove them into 12 units, but they have to move
The right
forward.
12 units.
Yeah.
The right 12 units.
Yeah.
But that goes back to the question of planning that you were mentioning before. And if we plan in advance for the kinds of sections we want and the kinds of mixes, then we can have meaningful classes for them instead of just sticking them in any class that they'll fit into, such as having students from China in Chinese 1. We're trying to avoid that.
I will say, I personally think that it shouldn't necessarily go down all the way to G. I think D is more around where I would see it. But if you, because I'm obviously not in that process as a student, feel that process is actually feasible, that it's not going to hurt these students and these extra classes will actually still be able to be created, we will have the forward planning that's efficient and effective so that we know exactly, or a good number of how many students we'll have and be able to plan around that, then that's something I can go along with. But I need reassurance basically that is something that is absolutely possible.
Well, I think it is important to know that at that point, these continuing international students would register basically through the same process as all other students. In other words, they wouldn't be assigned to any particular class. They would have all the options that are available to any other student.
District residents of the Pasadena Area Community College District and continuing international students with F1 visas, that probably would be a safe place to put them, and then they'd end up we'd be able to maintain our commitment to them legally, they'd be in good stead, et cetera.
Chris?
Just to remain kind of constant throughout the process, why don't we just continue to have it right after D, the way that we have G right after F, which is international after, new international after new in district? We could have continuing international after continuing in district.
So right after D.
Yeah.
That works.
Is there any comments or questions about that, moving B to right after D?
Can you just explain the creation of classes? I mean, hypothetically, how would it work? You have a class that you have the 60/40, or it fills up. At what point is a new class created throughout this process?
The only time that we would create a new class is if after the process was completed. In other words, the schedule was full, everybody was there, we suddenly ended up with international students who for some reason or another were not taken care of in that situation. However, based upon where we just discussed and placed it, I think the likelihood of that occurring is probably less, unless it's a new group of students who come in who require ESL and only ESL to get them a certain point. Would you agree, Ted, with that?
Well, yeah, obviously, when we get a group that requires that much ESL, then, that's a different, they can't just get into the other kinds of classes.
But in most cases, I think it probably might work, if we do this, I think it would probably work fine in most cases.
But Ted,
Particularly
correct me if I'm wrong, if we are talking about recruiting more international students, these will be new students, brand new. Usually those students register in about 9 units of a combination of ESL courses and then 1 additional course in another topic.
They have to have 12 units.
I'm sorry?
They would have to have 12 units.
Yes, 9 units of ESL
But
and then 3 units more of another course.
If they take one of our ESL blocks that we've put together for F1 visa students, then that's the combination for the lower levels of ESL.
Right.
That's what we've been doing.
And we're also creating the ESL pathways right now as well, which take all this into account.
Right, and that's what I was about to mention. Then that, in fact, I'm wondering if that's something that needs to be included on here. We talk about first year experience pathways. Do we want to talk about other pathways on here, or is that just kind of understood it's separate?
Yes, the first year experience pathways implies all pathways for the first year group. So, because we have international, we have design tech, we have the UGIMA, Puente, all of those different pathways we already have lined up as we create more.
Bob, you mentioned the fact that the board might consider adding up to maybe 3,000 international students. So let's suppose it's 2,000 more. Will they be displacing 2,000 in-state students, in order to maintain the cap that we have?
Because they would be paying tuition, the answer is no, because they'd be a self-funding group. And in fact, on the basis of the roughly 1,000 international students we have right now, the district nets somewhere between $4 and $5 million, as I recall. We net that. So then, as a revenue enhancement strategy, we would add more international students so we could net more revenue that we could then invest in local programs. That's the reason, one of the reasons why we would do this.
Would we then have to change, looking at the notes from our last meeting, I'm looking at 2D. It says, Ana Ogaz mentioned the revision, amend this item to address a pathways limitation of 1,000 students and having approximately 1,000 international students. Would that have to be amended? Should we amend that now then, or, if we have 1,000, it might go up. So should that number change, or just leave it blank?
I don't see what you're...
Under the our minutes from the last meeting, second page.
Oh.
2D.
Pathways limitation.
There's a word, approximately 1,000 international students. I don't know if that's meant to be inserted into the 2D procedures.
I think my comment was that, why were we saying pathway students had priority when it's really a small number? It's 1,000 students.
I see.
In the scope of how many total students we have enrolled.
Right.
I was just questioning why they needed to be identified as a group that gets priority. And that included the group of internationals.
Yeah, and going forward in 12-13, we're looking at 1,000. But as we go beyond that, hopefully that number will grow. But I think the reason why we specifically spelled out pathways is because we want to make sure that students start their community college experience, quote unquote, right. We want to give them their math, their English, their College One course, so that they start their experience in a manner that perhaps helps them lead to greater success as they go forward. We wouldn't want students to come in, or maybe we would, but the idea is that if we're going to give students priority, we want to give them priority with certain parameters, which will then help them to get to the completion of whatever their goal is, perhaps quicker than if they just came in and took anything that they wanted to take without having any sense of where they were going or how they're going to get there. So that's why pathways was called out. First year experience pathways was called out specifically. And in fact, if this works as we go forward and the number of pathways grows, in this area of strategic enrollment management, then perhaps we can quicken students' completion through our college.
John?
Actually, it's regarding 2C, students who fail to declare a program of study after 30 units completed at PCC. As I was aware, in the Student Success Task Force recommendations, the wording was with semesters and not the units enrolled. I was wondering why the choice of using units as the meter for that.
I have to admit, I don't recall
Well,
my
I think
process in that, but we could
to-
change that.
I think it has to, no, we were very specific about
they
why it
were.
was 30 units.
Yeah,
I don't remember
Because
that.
we didn't want to do it by time.
Okay.
See, and 60 units is the lower division undergraduate. 60 units is when you can matriculate out of here. And the idea is that halfway through that target goal
Figure
of
it
60,
out.
you should figure it out.
Okay, I definitely agree with the idea. I was just wondering if we would be forced into a different kind of wording by the student success.
No, I think from the Student Success Task Force, that was their recommendation, but we can implement it as we believe fit at the local level. Okay. But were there any more comments on the proposed Section 1 of the procedures?
I have a general question.
Yes, Amy? This, once this is completed here, this will go forward to the Academic Senate as a recommendation. And then the Academic Senate will vote on it, and from there it goes on to CAPM, since this is an academic and professional matter, and if the administration agrees, and I
But
expect they
the
will.
Academic Senate isn't working on their own version, are they? So we'll have.
No, I mean,
Okay,
this is going
it.
forward to the
Okay,
Academic
great.
Senate,
All right,
because
that's
this
good.
is a shared governance committee with
Okay.
representatives of the administration,
Right.
managers, faculty, classified, and so on.
Okay, thank you.
And because this is an academic and professional matter, once it gets through the Academic Senate and gets through CAPM, it will go to the College Council as an information item.
Okay.
And then ultimately the Board of Trustees, of course.
And the ultimate Board of Trustees will go to their board subcommittee on policy.
Right, thank you.
Okay, any other comments on Section 1 or changes?
So are we voting then to move B under D?
I think there was a consensus, unless I'm mistaken. Okay. All right, any other comments, though, on Section 2? John?
Sorry, one more. Again, Student Success Task Force. I was wondering why 100 units was the chosen number as opposed to the 110.
I think we just sort of rounded it out.
The number's been as low as 90, that's been kicked around, and as high as 110, and I think we just thought we'd just land in the middle.
Okay.
Nothing more profound than that. Yes. Chris?
So I know last week we struck item A, and I see here we have A with the little caveat at the end of it.
Yes, this was, I think this came from Anna, to remove item A, but I'm wondering if perhaps we couldn't just amend it with the words in parentheses where it says, pending the implementation of technology that permits the college to correctly identify such students. And that's referring back to students who are identified as not following their educational plans.
Again, just as someone who's worked with documents like this before, I personally don't like the idea of having kind of those words like pending and clauses where it's about things that may or may not happen in the future. This should be kind of a definite document, and it's relatively easy to modify. It's much better, and so I think that once we have those, then it should be brought back, and then that could be added. I don't think it should be added until we have that in there. Does that make sense?
Any other comments?
Well,
I'm actually happy to see that in there, and I understand your concern that a document's going to live somewhere, and hopefully this will change. But there is a big class of students who are not tracked anyway at the college, and it makes me feel better that those students are in our radar by saying this.
and I also think that, our new administrative information system will definitely have the ability to create education plans and then to allow counselors and faculty and others to track students' progress through those plans. So I don't personally see anything wrong with putting a document together that projects into the future. To the degree that we cannot identify whether students are following their plans or not, then obviously we can't implement A. But
Right.
once we can, we will, and we can move forward.
Chris?
I suppose in response especially to that comment is that I agree. I think that we need to be able to track these students. I think it's only going to increase the effectiveness of how to serve students on campus. I just don't know if this is the appropriate place to have that as a direction for our college. I think that we should have that as a direction within things like the information technology system of this is what we want to do so we can help students, as opposed to we want to keep track of students because if they're not following this, we want to make them lose their priority. Again, I just don't think for this to be the step that we're actually documenting that we want to track these students, that this is something that the college is moving towards. I don't feel this is the appropriate place to do that.
I'm wondering if we could just remove the wording in parentheses
That's what I would do.
and just leave students who are identified as not following their educational plans, which means that until we do identify them,
Right.
nothing happens.
But that was the initial, well, just to respond, that was the initial concern, the fact that we don't have a system, a process for doing that. It just renders it moot.
Well, moot for the time
I
being.
think we could, but it's very cumbersome. So we're not.
And also, we are, of course, we've all heard this before, but we are inches away from having a functioning ed plan working again, right?
Maybe more than a few inches.
Well, but we're getting much, and this is the ed plan that Bob Lane is finishing the programming on, and it looks like it's going to be implemented relatively soon, or can be. The counselors actually had an orientation on it last Friday, I believe. Were you there? But in any event, we will have something, but when the new AIS comes in, we'll have something that's even much more robust and all that kind of stuff.
Glenna?
Hypothetical. What if we know the student has an ed plan and they're not following it? Wouldn't this open this up for discrimination against some kids that we know about and some kids that we don't know about by having this in here? No?
I don't know. So you said if we happen to know?
Suppose there's a student that they have an ed plan and they're not following it, and we know about it. But others, we don't know if they're following it. So I'm kind of like with.
Okay. Just to respond briefly, I think the only way that we would know at this point would be if a student comes to your office and shows you the paper ed plans that we make in counseling. That's as close as we get to students having an ed plan. Okay, all right.
But doesn't the Student Success Task Force recommend that all
Yes, it
students
does.
must follow an ed
Yes, it
plan?
does.
Yes.
And so as we get our new system in place, our students will be following ed plans, and it won't be discriminatory. We'll be able to track them in a positive, supportive way to say, hey, come on in, Glenna, what happened? You got off track here. And so I think we have to think of this as going towards the future, that we will be able to do this. Otherwise, we're going to be back here next year, every Monday. Not that I don't love it.
Anna?
Glenna brought up a good point, because currently, I believe EOP, financial aid, veterans, paper ed plans are monitored by those respective offices. So those students could potentially get in trouble and lose their registration priority according to this proposed draft, because they are being monitored and everybody else is not. So I think we should not have that wording in parentheses. It should be deleted.
Okay. Bob?
No, I think, I would agree. I think, and Crystal, we pull the words in parentheses and just leave the statement as is, assuming going forward we'll have the wherewithal to do all this, I think we're going to be fine personally.
Is that the consensus of Chris?
I just don't like the idea of it personally. As a student representative, I think that it's inappropriate for the college to kind of be planning ahead to punish these students, that once we have this system up, we're going to be the first thing we're going to use it for is to take away priority. I think that, again, the focus on this plan, which I think it's great to have the services, but I think the focus of the services needs to be to help students first. And then after we've seen how that's working, then we can say, okay, we have a system in place, we have an efficient system in place. Because having a system is one thing, but making sure the system's actually working correctly is something that also we'll have to review within ourselves. And I think until we are able to do that, I'm just not comfortable with this at all.
But you have three.
Ted, Shelley, and then Crystal.
Okay, well, what I was going to say is the idea of having the ed plans and pathways is exactly that, to be able to give the support to the students and give them this priority because they're following this procedure. If they're getting special priority by following a procedure and they stop following it, then it's not necessarily punitive, it's that they don't get that same special priority and they go to the general category of whichever category they fit into.
Shelley?
Two things. Yeah, I would agree we could take the parens out, since we don't really want to call attention to the fact that we don't do this, maybe. And we assume we can track all the other things on the list, so why wouldn't we not be able to track the first one? My question about what qualifies as not following the ed plan? What if a student just couldn't get those classes that semester and they've fallen off the ed plan?
Okay. Good point. Amy? Oh, I'm sorry, it's Crystal then Amy, sorry.
Well, I'm not 100% sure, but I think the intent of this was not punitive at all.
Right.
I think the intent of this was to say, we're going to support students as much as possible to get them through the institution. This is really more about us taking the responsibility to find these students, support them, help them get the classes they need so they can follow their ed plan. I don't think there's anything punitive meant in this at all. I would assume that once we get the ed plans in place and we can identify students, we start doing interventions to help them get through. I think that's what we're talking about here.
Amy?
That's exactly what I was going to say, but she said it far better. But for Chris, number 3 takes care of all of your concerns. If a student feels that they have been incorrectly identified, they have an appeal process. So,
And that's definitely why I wrote number 3, is to address those concerns, because I understand that I may very well be the minority on my views here, and I think that is a good compromise of how to kind of put that in. I just feel that in response to, I don't think that we're trying to be punitive, but as a student, when I read this, I see the second section now in this says least priority will assign to students in the following categories. It's not priorities students in the following categories need to be improved. I need to go through certain. I'm sorry, is that me? But need to have. We need to stage these interventions. That's number 3, which I propose. I see this, and I think students, the very few students who will actually read this policy, would see it the same way. It's saying, I'm going to lose my priority because I'm not doing this. And it may not mean to be punitive, it may be to try to help the students, but that's literally what the words are saying, is that we're taking away the priority. It's not that those who have the ed plan have a greater priority than them, it's that those who don't have it are getting their priority taken away.
Dave, did you have a comment?
I think what needs to be remembered is that priority is all students, and students trying to get the right classes to move on. And so it can't really be seen as a punitive thing when, if I'm giving up my priority because because I've stated I want to be an English major and I'm not really following an English major pathway, then I'm just kind of giving up my right so that the person who's a biology major who desperately needs to have biology 11 to get out of here will have that chance in lieu of me having that chance. And I think that needs to be kept in mind, that we're talking about students and students. And we're talking about making sure that the students who need to get going and get on have the best opportunity to do that, versus students who are here for extended periods of time and don't necessarily have a path forward or don't feel like they need to follow a path forward.
All right, we'll just start there, go around. John?
Thank you. I agree very much with that, but I'm not sure if now is the right time to include this wording for 2A, simply because it essentially approves of the educational plans prior to seeing them, so we don't necessarily know that they're not too narrow in scope, and that it wouldn't necessarily limit a student from taking classes which may technically be outside of their ed plan, but which may be for their general education, which I feel like that could be dangerous too, in that limiting student scope of academic pursuits. I think I don't think it should be included now, but for future wording, I think that students who are identified and then add after identified by, and that would solve a couple of the problems concerns that I heard earlier. So identified by a process so that we know that it's essentially there. There is a process, okay.
Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my issue is specifically with 2A, but I'm kind of against 2 as a whole, and I have been since I first saw this policy. Again, I understand that I'm in the minority. But just as a student representative, I don't think that's something, we've gone on for years with having priority just with, the old 1 and 2, and really the 2 being the kind of 1 and going along with it. And now we're creating this, which I understand we definitely need to make things more efficient, but I guess I just don't like the idea of penalizing students, and I especially don't like it when we don't have the infrastructure available yet. I agree that we'll hopefully have that someday, but I certainly have no promise of that. No one here really does, but I especially don't, because I'm not going to be here anymore. I'm not going to be able to continue to advocate in students on behalf of this. Students have a much shorter lifespan here at PCC than everyone else does, and so when I see this, I see us banking on the future, and the future is something that I specifically cannot count on.
We'll finish here and then go back to you. Was there somebody else who wanted to speak? Eduardo?
I do understand, or I see Chris's point about it being punitive. It sounds punitive in nature. So I'm wondering if it's possible that after 2, where we're saying, okay, if you don't do this, we're going to punish you by putting you down here, is it possible for us to then some way be more proactive by specifically delineating what the student can do, or what the college will then do to put that student back on track? So not just simply say, you don't do this, we're going to do that. And so rather than say, if you fall off and you're at the bottom, if you want to go back, these are the steps that you should take. And then I think that might resolve both issues.
Anyone else on this table?
I was just going to bring up the question of how an ed plan could be modified. I mean, we're talking about this as if the student gets here on day 1, they get an ed plan, it's set in stone, that's it. They have to follow it, and if anything happens, like they can't get their English 1 class, so they have to take the Bio 11, then they're gone forever, and I don't think that's the situation.
Oh, it's quite true that ed plans get modified frequently. They are frequently modified for financial aid purposes, and the student simply comes to see a counselor, and we review their plan, and again, at this point, it's simply a paper document that would reflect that change.
If they're making a good faith effort to follow it, but they can't get the class, or they decide to change their major, or they don't get the financial aid, they have mechanisms by which they modify the ed plan. So if they're still in compliance with an ed plan, just might not be the same one they had on day one.
Yes.
I did want to, at the appropriate, I want to follow up on Eduardo's comment when appropriate.
And Rod?
I just want to kind of speak to the speculative nature of basing policy on ed plans at this point in time. It's my understanding that a minority of students have ed plans now. I've heard the figure 1 in 10. One of the limitations is keeping more students from having ed plans is availability of counseling time. So it seems to me that until we actually have more experience and are able to achieve universal ed plan status, that we really don't know what this thing is going to look like statistically, how many students are going to be able to comply within what time frame. And I would recommend striking this for now, and once we actually have achieved universal ed plans, which would be the basis you would need to have to make this a fair policy, that we then look at the data and see what it tells us and see if it tells us we need to move in this direction.
As a follow-up to Eduardo's suggestion, 2A could read, students who are identified as not following their educational plans after proactive interventions by the college to help that student adjust their ed plan have been accomplished or have been done or something. In other words, what that basically says, it puts the onus on the institution to work proactively with the student to try and make the adjustment that is necessary. So I personally think Eduardo's idea was a good one. And then to respond to Rod real quick, I think, again, this whole thing, according to the Student Success Task Force and everything else, it's all about trying to help students to move through the system faster to make room for other students who are trying to get through. And I do think that we are going to have a functioning ed plan. Whether or not it turns universal or not, it might take 3 years for it to become universal. But in the meantime, if a student does have an ed plan and they are following it, this language basically is designed to try to give the student and the college options as to the priority of that student. That's all.
Could you repeat your amendment?
It would basically say students who are identified as not following their education plans after proactive interventions by the college to help the student adjust their ed plan have been done or have been accomplished.
Comments on that, Lena?
I'm kind of with Rod here. I really, really don't like the speculative thing in there, and it's one sentence that we can put in after we know the AIS is going to work. I've been at the campus a long time, and I've heard this is going to work, this is going to work, this is going to work, and it doesn't sometimes. And so I'm not going to believe it until I see it anyway.
Anna?
I'm looking back at the minutes, page 2 and 3. I recommended removal of 3A last meeting, and we voted on it, and there were 6 ayes and 1 opposed, so it passed. So why are we talking about this again today?
Is it 3A or 2A?
It was 3A then, now it's 2A.
It's the old 3A.
The old 3A.
I may have misunderstood.
We just wasted 45 minutes.
Okay. All right. But, okay. All right, so what is now item 2A, should simply be removed for now? Okay. It can,
Feature, so it can go in.
it can always be brought back at a more appropriate time. All right. There seems to be not only a vote, but a consensus.
You bring that up now?
Yeah. 20 minutes.
We need to read the minutes more carefully.
I do. All right, so, Anna.
Okay, the other comment I have, okay, the new 1A through J, that is a ranking, right? It's a
Yes.
ranking.
Right.
Why don't we just incorporate the new 2B through D and put those as
Bottom.
ALM? And that just shows those are in the lowest priority. So then it doesn't sound as punitive. They're just lowest on the totem pole.
That may be a
So
very
you mean
good
just
idea.
move items
Now, that's a good
2B, C, and D into
So,
On KLM.
KLM?
or whatever the new, it's going to be
Right.
LMN, but you're right.
Okay.
they're all gonna
That's an
be under
interesting idea.
one.
Comments on that, Chris?
I like the idea that sounds less punitive, but I feel like it would effectively be more punitive than what I propose under what is now 3D, which is that those students who would lose their priority would not go to the end of all priority, but would go to the end of the priority within their own group within what is now A. Does that make sense? So if they're a continuing student who loses their priority, they don't go from continuing in-district student, they don't go all the way to after all new or returning students, but they just are the last of the continuing in-district students.
So to clarify, if I go over 100 units, but I'm a continuing student, my priority stays way up there with continuing students, but at the end?
Of continuing students,
I don't agree
yes.
with that at all. I think that going over 100 units, I should go to the very bottom.
We'll get to that one in a minute.
Well, yeah.
But they are interrelated.
Right, but again, the proposal was to move items 2B, C, D to the list under section 1. That agreed upon, or should we maintain these two separate greatest priority and least priority sections?
The idea makes sense.
I think blending them makes a lot of sense.
Then take out the word greatest.
Okay,
It
right,
just says priority.
right.
But then you have to decide how to rank B, C, and D on 2, because they're not ranked there.
I am assuming that they'll just go in the same order that they're
In that order?
here.
Sorry, is this including Dr. Miller's edit?
No, my
The
edit got-
Edit to A, no, the whole thing
Okay.
has been removed.
Well, it's been removed.
Right.
2A.
So we would only move items B, C, and D.
I have a problem with the order of B, C, and D.
Yeah, that's
All
what
right.
Amy was
Tell us.
suggesting, yeah.
Because I'm really on you got 100 units, you need to go down.
Oh,
And that
Okay.
one, well, that would be the down.
That would be the
That's
last one.
That'd be the last
right?
one, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
so are you comfortable with maintaining B, C, and D, at least in that order? Chris?
On that note, I think that actually B should be last. Students
should
who are
be last.
actually been identified as being on probation should be last.
Okay.
I-
Comments, questions
I
there?
don't
No, I don't
get that.
agree. No.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I really don't think that wording addresses that it's going to be in that order. With least priority for registration
It's
shall be
coming
assigned
out.
to
No,
students.
that
Coming
that
out.
line's coming out.
The line will come out.
Yeah.
Right, so we're just talking about items B, C, and D. Any other questions about those?
Just something in general. If and when we approve this, the wording, everything, and it's implemented, will this be effective for the students that, let's suppose that by 2013, we approve it and it's effective. Will these rules then apply for students applying for 2013 and not those that are in the pipeline? Or is there something we can do for those that have 100 units, more than 100 units right now, are in the pipeline
Read
to
this.
I think
push
we're
them out?
going, I think we're going to address that issue.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I tried to put something together that would help with that. Okay.
Okay. All right, there seems to be a consensus to move those three items up to category 1 and in that same order. Anna?
Would each item begin with continuing students who have been on academic?
Just be all students.
I don't see
Yeah,
why
it
we
would
need
have
to
to be
have.
I
continuing.
think it would be all.
Or it'd be, you have to say continuing new and all.
I don't think you have to
Well,
say
they would be.
continuing, because
They
if we
would
have
all
more
be
than 100
continuing.
units,
They have
I
100
mean, you
units.
could have a new student who's readmitted on probation. He was disqualified on academic probation, he sits out the required amount of semesters, he petitions for reinstatement in admissions and records, and then comes in with the new.
Well, he would no longer be on probation, right? He or she would no longer be on probation if they are,
No, they're readmitted on probation.
Yeah, they
So-
are.
So the GPA is
They're readmitted
still
on
1.7.
probation.
Anna, would it be students who have been on academic or progress probation for 2 or more continuous terms? If we add the word continuous, would that resolve?
Consecutive.
Or consecutive, thank you, consecutive terms? In other words, I think the issue is someone who continually is on academic probation as opposed to someone who falls in and out of it based upon a very difficult major or whatever going on in their lives or something like that. It's consecutive, I think, is might be the concern.
You know, I don't really know exactly how our record system flags them when they're on probation. I just know I've worked with many who are coming back, they're still on academic probation, but they're registering with new students.
Which
because
again,
they've been away from the college.
yeah, so again, if we use the word consecutive, then the consecutive would indicate some sort of habitual or some kind of a, an issue that for whatever reason they're consecutively not progressing and therefore taking up a spot that someone who could progress. In other words, they need other types of interventions, I guess is what I'm trying to suggest.
I would say that's okay. Does our student record system have the ability to identify them as such? I don't know.
Question, so if a student goes out on, let's say they've got however many semesters of probation and they're out, and when they come back, the only consequence of the probation is that they were out for a while, but they would come back, and you're saying then they would fit into one of these categories up here regardless of the fact they had already been here and went out on probation, as opposed to coming back and starting at the bottom, so to speak, to work their ways out?
Well, because their GPA is still below 2.0, that student's considered readmitted on academic probation, and admissions might be limiting units. So she only can register for 6 units because she's still on probation.
But what you're saying is that student coming in should be then in a category, say, with returning students or something up here, instead of coming back off probation and they're at the bottom or towards the bottom of the list. I'm trying to understand what you're proposing.
I was just thinking that the new KLM, shouldn't it be prefaced with those are continuing students who are in that category?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I get it. So you're suggesting that, looking at that B, that's now B, that may be K. Students have been on academic probation. These are continuing students who are at the bottom, right? But there may be a student who's new, who has been on academic probation. So you want this one, the K, to now say continuing students, so that you don't confuse them with those coming back. Is that true? You want to make it continuing, students who are on academic.
It's getting more complicated as I think about it.
Well, one comment is as far as D, students who have more than 100 units, we don't need to put continuing. If they have more than 100 units, we still want them at the bottom of the list, regardless of whether they were here last semester or it was 2 semesters ago. If they've accumulated 120 units, we don't want them to be able to jump in here as a new or returning student and suddenly be up higher in the priority rank. They still have the 120 units. So for D, I don't see any need for having the term continuing, because they're over 100, they're over 100.
Right. And wouldn't they fall under I anyway, if you look at I? So if I've been on academic probation and I have not been attending for 2 semesters, and I come back, I'm limited to only 6 units anyway. Wouldn't I fall under I anyway? Because I'm at the end.
You mean as a re-entering student?
As a re-entry student.
Yeah,
Because they're going to limit my units anyway.
Unless they're in district, and then they're F, returning in district students.
I think if we were to add the word 2 or more consecutive, add the word consecutive before terms, try it. If we run into issues because of it, we can always come back and adjust it. But at least the consecutive implies a student who on a regular basis has fallen into this category.
I like that.
I think John and then Glenna.
I like that suggestion. The concern I have with it is I'm wondering if a student who falls under that level will be able to achieve getting above that level before 2 consecutive terms are achieved or essentially done. So if someone would still not qualify after having a good term and then a second, so having a bad term falling way below and then having a good term and not being able to essentially compensate for the bad term, would that negatively affect it if we had the wording consecutive?
So
They would
so-
still be on probation. Is that
Oh.
what you're saying, right? Because they would not have gotten their GPA above a 2.0.
Yes, but they would have had a good term.
They would still be on probation.
That's,
right, yeah.
that's where my issue is with just adding consecutive. Maybe if we added something as well, but I do like the addition of it.
Brenda?
Jurisdiction on the 100 units? Say you went off, let's say I decided I wanted to come back and I've got 100 units and 30 years later I want to come back and do something else. Is there a jurisdiction on that?
You mean, is it
You mean a
limited?
term limit?
Statute of limitations, sorry, statute of limitations.
No?
No?
I mean, not the way this is worded.
I mean, that happens a lot with people that were in the workforce for 20 years and now they're fired and they're coming back and they may have 100 units and now they're out of luck, right?
100 PCC units.
Right, yeah, so we would only track those here at BCC.
You know, everything is appealable, exceptions,
Right.
I mean,
Right.
there's, nothing,
Trying to cover everybody.
I know.
Chris, did you have something?
Yeah, I have a number of issues. First off, if we add that in, we are going to have to change E to say something, all other continuing students other than those identified in JKL, whatever it is, KLM. Second, we'd also have to change a lot of the language in the proposed section 3, the new section 3. And I don't think that, I can see the reasoning behind moving it just into one full thing, but at the same time, I think that it becomes too, because I feel like 2, in my hopes, is a temporary thing for those students. If a student falls under one of those, then the real reason for this to happen is to make it so that they can then grow into someone who would no longer lose that priority. And I really see it as a priority loss, as it's and that's why I have the wording in section 3 as I do, is because it's really a losing of their priority. And I'd like to think that they could regain it, and I don't think that's as they'd be as able to do that if it was just kind of created into one list. Sense?
Okay.
I think the deliberations of the Student Success Task Force and others is the recognition that resources are much less than they have been, and that projection is that those resources are going to continue to be less for some years to come. And therefore, some type of priority is needed in order to make certain that the 150,000 students left at the front door last year who could not get in can somehow get in. And that, in fact, unless there is some value ascribed to a benefit that people get, or something where they recognize that they do not perform in a certain way, that they will not necessarily have over and over and over again opportunities to get the same item. That's part of what this is all about, is actually establishing some priorities so people respect and value that which they are being afforded, and therefore perform as need be. And I think that's what this is all about. And I think at some point, what the Student Success Task Force people were saying, what the Board of Governors is saying, and I think what our Board of Trustees would like to say is that there has to be some limitations. And that's what this is an effort for. And you're right, where there's always going to be someone who is going to get caught in this, but that's what an appeal process is about, to try and deal with that person's individual problems.
Oh, Shelley?
I think I agree with that. A couple meetings ago, somebody said, we can't be all things to all people. And we sort of all just didn't say anything. And later I thought, well, that's half right. We can't be all things, but we have to be for all people. But I think the things that Chris is talking about, all of the appeals process, does take that into consideration.
Are we ready to go on to that section? All right, so on the next page, this in essence is what Chris has proposed, an appeals process, basically. I did add, this is basically what you sent to me, Chris, but I did add in parentheses a couple of words that we might want to substitute, but certainly we'll discuss that. So Chris, do you want to go ahead and tell us what your thoughts are behind section 3 as a whole?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, this is for those things that the kind of the the compromise that I had of if this is going to be a process where students are going to be, again, losing their priority, then there should be a process that allows them to get it back. And this enrollment and this appeals process, I think, is a big plan, because there's so many students that would get lost in the system. Students who, because of the financial matters that we've already been dealing with for years, students who may have over 100 units or may not be following their ed plan on paper because they couldn't get into the classes that they need to follow their ed plan or to get the units that they wanted to and get out of here within 2 years like they originally planned to. And I think that needs to be taken into consideration before these students can actually lose their registration. So I created this process that I think would be good, and I actually had a couple revisions as well that I'll go through as we go through it. So the first, the loss of students registration priority due to reasons detailed under Section 2 must go through the following process. First, students will be identified by the college as losing priority under Section 2's provisions. So they actually obviously they have to be identified first. B, students will be notified of their change in registration priority and supplied with the tools, and you put information. We could do either or. I think we do both. Supplied with the tools and information needed to repair their status before their priority is lost, if applicable. C, students unable to repair the cause of their priority loss may use an appeals process to petition against the priority loss, and then the college will, I think, instead of survey, review each appeal case, and then change it to and make a decision regarding their priority loss, as opposed to decide to revoke or confirm. College will take the student's history and academic compliance into consideration, including but not limited to the following. And these are the kind of things that I think are examples of what needs to be taken into consideration when discussing whether they should be losing their priority. Things like their distance from completing a transfer degree or certificate, which is also kind of in this new draft language, but as well as, if they're at 102 units, but they only need 2 more units to graduate, should they be taken all the way down to K or what have you? A change in the student's education plan, and I'd say, and progress towards a new goal within their tenure at PCC, to make it, again, just for the same reason. Or if they came back 30 years later, having a new goal, and as long as they're progressing towards that goal, I think it's something that should be taken into account.
Just to add, I think this is what prompted me not to remove that item that in entirety about the education plan, since you had made reference yourself within your appeals process. But so we might revisit that item. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
And then just to briefly continue, the students' reasons for enrolling their classes, including the availability of those classes and their need for full-time unit status, and then any personal, professional, or economic issues that result in the cause of their priority loss. Those remaining students, this is the last part that I put, who have not repaired or addressed their issues nor appealed their priority loss will automatically be considered last of all students within their categories outlined under Section 1, which is, again, what I feel sounds like no one agrees with me on that aspect.
All right. Are there questions for Chris?
3B, students will be notified. How do you, is there a method of preference, email, mail, phone call?
In all honesty, I think that it would be nice we have all that information. I don't know how, I've never received a phone call from PCC. I have received emails. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was what we ended up doing. But I think that it should be, I honestly think that these students should be reached out to and spoken to in person.
This isn't high school anymore. And you get to a point where when do people take responsibility for their own acts? And I think I'm not necessarily against this, but I think of the burden that this puts on the institution to notify what is 25 to 30,000 students a semester that we have to do, and I just wonder when people have to take responsibility for their own selves as they progress through a system. And I don't mean to sound harsh about it, but I'm just wondering, how do we find some middle ground? Is the middle ground simply that once they are put on probation, once that happens to them, then they can appeal it, and they're just notified of that? I don't know.
Anna?
I think right now with our old student record system, when a student's on probation, it's noted on their records, and I believe the student gets a message in Lancer Link.
Yeah.
So that's it. I mean, there's no letter, there's no hi, phone call, no email, nothing. It's something posted in Lancer Link. So I think as we're writing new things, we need to keep that in mind, that we don't have a great system right now. And we will have something hopefully 2.5 years from now. But I don't think we have the ability to notify them in this detail right now.
Chris?
I suppose in response to both those comments, I think that's one of the reasons why I put this in here, is I think that until we have that ability to notify them, it's not appropriate for them to be taken there of a priority, because from my experience here, and my experience especially within shared governance, I've seen that one of the major problems between areas on campus is the lack of communication. Is that not necessarily that the information's not out there, but that's not accurately being communicated. And I've seen that not only for students, but for faculty. Faculty, for example, the adding of the units, the ad slips, the ad codes this semester. Many faculty they didn't know all the information. That's one of the reasons, is because they had to go through their deans, and there's just a lot of communication going on. And I think that direct communication to the student is the only way to guarantee that they understand what's happening to them. And I foresee a future where if we didn't have this, if we didn't have it being at least an email out to them directly that tells them, then the vast majority of students who this happens to would have no idea what was going on. They'd probably end up trying to see a counselor and say, why is my registration date so late? They'd probably have to try to go through a process because they wouldn't understand what's going on. And I think that if that's the case, which I personally think it would be, then I think that there needs to be something institutional to make sure that doesn't happen.
Well, I'm the activation or the implementation of the new AS is going to be on a 12 to 18 month schedule. So I suspect it will be I saw a demonstration this morning where it would be very possible to send a note to a student and to notify them, an email or even a text. I mean, the technology's there. It's not impossible to do. And I'm sure it could even be automated if someone falls under a threshold. So I don't think that that's a big deal. I think it's possible.
Faith?
To piggyback on that, any of the new AISs that are going to be brought in are going to have their own portal. And I know where I'm a student, for example, I know as soon as I log in to my portal, which is where all business is done from the student perspective and increasingly the faculty perspective, I know as soon as I log in and click registration whether I have a hold or not, or what my priority level is. And then I'm given the proper step to take care of that. So in the very near future, these are all issues that will be built into the process.
Lena?
One issue that I face constantly at registration time is students coming in that have a priority, but they went to go on and they hadn't done their challenge form yet. Because they said, well, I came from another school, you have my records, I had algebra at Cal State Fullerton. But they don't seem to know that we don't look at their records. They have to go through their prerequisite challenge process before their registration date. I'm telling students constantly. But they come in, I was supposed to register this morning, but now I've lost my spot. So I really want them to know that. I don't know how we notify them that just because you've met your prereqs, if you haven't met them here, we're not going to see them.
Right, it's not automatic, right?
Yeah, so that's a big priority loss thing that I deal with every day.
Students assume also that our systems are much more robust and that they'll catch all these things, and there's no such thing. Yep. Right. Yeah. Okay. Any further discussion then of those items, A through C?
Well, if we're looking at the issue of identifying the students, is it possible with this new technology? I don't know, when students log in, maybe a little disclaimer, which tell them this is your GPA, this is the rules, 2.5 to 2.7, you're on probation, 2 or anything below, at least, and then they can check off or just click on it before they begin. This way, they are aware, they've read it, and if they didn't read it and they didn't click on it, they can't go any further. And this way, there's no way of no need to notify. Everyone is doing it as the process goes on. I don't know if that's possible.
Well, I suspect that the way this would work, whatever it is that we end up recommending, the student services staff, the IT folks would get together and figure out the ways in which we can do what we need to do. And if in fact, for some reason, it can't be done, then they'll kick it back up to the Enrollment Management Committee and say, guess what, this isn't possible, but if you do this, we can do this. So the what ifs, we could be talking for weeks about the what if scenarios. But I think Dave's comment was absolutely dead on, which is the technology will be there, and it's going to be a lot easier than we think from what the little I know about it and what I've already seen.
Final follow-up, all of these systems that we're going to be bringing in are systems that have been used by thousands of institutions that have all kinds of best practices already built in. They've reinvented the wheel for us, and they're going to be able to give us a much more streamlined and better way to do it than what we can even conceive right now.
Okay, thank you. Item D, I think needs some discussion because it does say those remaining students who have not repaired or addressed their issues nor appealed the priority loss will automatically be considered last of all the students within their category as outlined under Section 1. So, Chris, if I understand you correctly, you're advocating that students simply go to the back of their various categories outlined in page 2, section 1, rather than at the very end of the entire process.
Yes.
Why?
I think that this is obviously going to happen to continuing students more often than anyone else. All 3 or 4 of those are really based on continuing students. And continuing students, I think, understandably, have a pretty good registration. But even more importantly, there's a very large pool of them. And I think that going to the end of a pool of, say, 15,000 is still a huge deal. It's still a big loss. And I think that it's a hurt enough to make them go that far. Then I know that new students, for example, for spring, weren't able to register returning students until the end of January, when I was able to do so in December. So that's over a month of losing for going from December to this just because of this one thing. And I again think that's too harsh a punishment.
Bob?
Okay, so we agreed to everything more or less that's in 3. So there's an appeal, there's a notification process, there's an appeals process, there's everything we can think of to make sure that they don't end up completely unaware of what's happening, okay? And we even work with them to come up with interventions that will satisfy their needs and get them back on their track. But even at the end of that, you're saying that they still should get consideration within their categories. That seems to be too much to me. So if we just simply said those remaining students who have not repaired or not addressed their issues nor appealed their priority loss will automatically be considered to have the lowest priority, period. Because we've given them every opportunity to right the ship, and we've done that. It just seems like to go to go further, down the onion and peel all those layers back seems more than necessary.
Ted?
One of the things that we have identified that would be subject to appeal is the issue of the 100 units. And we have then an appeal process for that. With this, if they lose that appeal, they still have their 100, 120, whatever units. They're continuing students, so they get bumped up here. Even if the last time when they're continuing students, they've got pretty high priority. And one of the problems that we have are the people who keep taking up place in classes and they're not really making any progress for anything, which is why we want this 100 to be the lowest priority. So that would completely defeat the purpose of having that 100 here.
Right.
They still have their priority as a continuing student.
Right, but not as, they wouldn't have, for example,
As
because
much
they have
priority,
100,
but
they wouldn't be over someone who has 90, for example.
They
They would be
but
under everyone.
They still would be up in section D and not in E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M. See? That doesn't seem fair. I mean, if what we're trying to do is to be able to, frankly, encourage students to get through the program, and we're being generous, going up to 100 units in order to get to the 60, with this, the ultimate consequence of ignoring everything we're doing is you're still up in category D, just a little bit lower in category D. There's no teeth to that, you know. And I'm not trying to be punitive. What I'm saying,
Right.
what we've been saying all around is we've got people taking up seats, and then other new students trying to come in who can't get through their program of study because those seats are being occupied continually. And there aren't a lot of students in those categories, but we really don't want to have those students continuing to occupy those seats. We're turning away people in droves who really earnestly want to get into their classes. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're not just saying blanket. No, we've got an appeal process that you have very, very well worked out here. And so with this section D, that's saying even when, after all this intervention and an entire appeal process, even after all that, it pans out that, you know what, you really haven't done it. According to everybody who's involved with the appeal, there still is minimal, response for that. I agree with Bob. I think they're at the bottom of the list then.
Anything else
All right,
here?
I'll need
John?
to take a point of let's.
If we could,
I completely understand where you're coming from, and I can totally, I guess, I don't agree with it, but I see what you're trying to say.
At universities, they're not this nice. And really, the bottom line is, if you're at UCLA and you've just completely gone over, you get to a point where they say, goodbye. You're just gone. You don't get an appeal process. You don't get you're gone. And Bob's talking about how much hand-holding we're going to do. Well, part of the transition from high school to university, if we're a transition, is saying you're going to know up front, you have this much time to do it, which is more than they would give you elsewhere. You've got to get it done in that amount of time.
I mean, this was my proposal as a student representative, and I support it, but I understand if the committee does not.
thank you. All right, it's coming up almost 2 o'clock, so I know that people have classes to go to and meetings and so on. So our next meeting is the 9th. I will revise this, consulting with that little group that you mentioned. Myself, who was it? Dina, Chris, Bob.
Right.
I'll revise this, consulting with those individuals, bring it back to you on the 9th, and let's plan for a final vote on that day with one final version. Is that does that sound good to you, Anna?
Could you ask Dina to attend and let us know if all that we're proposing is possible in our current old-fashioned student record system?
Okay.
If it's not possible, then I don't think it should be in this.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, and I think we'll do that. Now, I did want to point out, there is something that I think is very important to the students, which is this thing that I drafted early this morning. And basically what this is, this I think deals with the gap, what I call the gap students. So basically what we want to do is we want to make sure that we don't lock out the continuing students that are in the system right now and immediately impact them. So what I've attempted to do with this language is basically to provide a way to deal with them, kind of a 2-year window to be able to satisfy the needs of those students so that we don't leave people in the lurch.
Right, and we don't need to incorporate this into the policy and procedures. We could simply agree to a
side letter.
A side letter, or side agreement, side recommendation from the Enrollment Management Committee.
Okay. All right, just wanted to make sure everybody saw that because I was concerned about that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.